March 2026. Somewhere on Earth, maybe deep in the Sahara, maybe on a fishing boat in the Pacific, a small electronic chime just went off. It means the same thing in both places: connection. A few years ago, that sound would not have meant very much. Satellite internet was still associated with slow speeds, high latency, and the feeling that it was useful only when everything else had failed. Today, that assumption is much harder to defend. By mid-March 2026, SpaceX had passed 10,000 active Starlink satellites in low Earth orbit, the largest satellite constellation in human history. On the ground, Starlink says it now serves more than 10 million active customers across more than 160 countries, territories, and other markets. Payload has estimated that the business could generate around $18.7 billion in revenue in 2026. That changes the story completely. Starlink is no longer just an interesting satellite internet experiment. It is becoming the financial engine of SpaceX, the backbone of a global communications network, and one of the clearest examples of how private companies can gain strategic power once reserved mostly for states. That is what makes this story so important. How did a project that once looked reckless become strong enough to challenge traditional telecom models? Why did Ookla's data show that Starlink accounted for roughly 97% of global satellite internet speed test samples in the third quarter of 2025? And why has this network become something far bigger than a broadband product? Something that now touches war, politics, and the future balance of power in orbit. Today, we are going to walk through the entire story: the original bet, the near disasters, the engineering breakthroughs, the money, the geopolitical consequences, and the deeper question underneath all of it. Because at the center of this story is an uncomfortable possibility. What happens when one private company gains the power to connect, or disconnect, large parts of the modern world? Is Starlink a miracle for places the old system never served properly? Or is it the beginning of a new form of orbital power that governments may not fully control? Let's start at the beginning. Back in 2015, at a private event in Seattle, Elon Musk stood in front of an audience and laid out a vision that sounded almost unreal at the time. He was not talking about Tesla. He was not talking about reusable rockets. He was talking about building a space-based internet network that could deliver fast, low-latency broadband to nearly anywhere on Earth. To do that, SpaceX wanted to launch 4,425 satellites into low Earth orbit. At the time, that number sounded outrageous. For perspective, humanity had launched only around 7,000 satellites in total across the previous 6 decades of spaceflight, and only a fraction were still active. Yet here was one private company talking about putting more functioning satellites in space than much of the rest of the world had operating combined. And the idea did not arrive in a vacuum. Before Musk, other major players had already tried to build satellite communication empires, and failed. In the 1990s, Iridium, backed by Motorola, burned through billions and ended up in bankruptcy. Teledesic, backed by Bill Gates and Saudi investor Prince Al Walid, also raised enormous sums and then faded away. The pattern was familiar. Launch costs were too high, satellite hardware was too expensive, and the product never became good enough for mass consumers at a price that made real business sense. Those companies were not necessarily foolish. In some ways, they were simply early. They were trying to build tomorrow with yesterday's tools. That is why so many analysts initially dismissed Musk's plan. The physics were unforgiving, the capital requirements were terrifying, and satellite communications is one of those industries where being almost right can still ruin you. But Musk was not thinking about Starlink as a side business. He was thinking about it as the missing financial engine behind something much larger. He understood a problem sitting behind all of SpaceX's grand promises. Launching rockets is impressive. Reusing rockets is revolutionary. But even a successful launch business may not generate the kind of steady, massive cash flow needed to support a civilization-scale project like Mars colonization. If Musk truly wanted to build the infrastructure for a self-sustaining city on another planet, he needed something bigger than launch revenue alone. He needed a cash machine. And in his mind, that machine would not be on Earth. It would be in orbit. That was the bet. But between a big idea and a working business lies the hardest stage of all: survival. On May 24, 2019, at Cape Canaveral, a Falcon 9 rocket tore through the night sky, carrying 60 Starlink satellites. These were not yet the final, polished version of the system. SpaceX had already launched 2 test satellites, Tintin-A and Tintin-B, in 2018. But this V0.9 mission was the first real large-scale move toward mass deployment. Inside SpaceX, the pressure was enormous. Every Falcon 9 launch already carried serious financial and technical stakes. But Starlink raised the risk further, because this mission was not just about putting hardware in orbit. Those satellites had to function. They had to communicate. They had to be managed at scale. And they had to prove that Starlink could move from science project to industrial system. When the satellites were released, the world saw one of the most striking images of the modern space age: a glowing train of spacecraft drifting like a string of pearls through the darkness. To the public, it looked futuristic. To amateur skywatchers, it looked almost magical. But behind that spectacle was a much harsher reality. Starlink's early years were punishing. SpaceX was spending at an extraordinary rate, building satellites, launching them, expanding ground infrastructure, and trying to solve several difficult engineering problems at the same time. Musk later admitted that Starlink at one point came dangerously close to bankruptcy. That was not just colorful language. At several points, the company really was racing against a clock made of cash burn, production pressure, launch cadence, and investor patience. And the technical challenges were just as brutal. How do you manufacture satellites more like consumer electronics than handcrafted aerospace monuments? How do you control thousands of moving spacecraft in real time while avoiding collisions with each other and with the growing cloud of debris around Earth? How do you build a user terminal small enough for ordinary people to install, but smart enough to track fast-moving satellites overhead? Any one of those questions could have broken the project. The teams working on Starlink had to abandon much of the traditional satellite industry mindset. Older satellites were built like floating cathedrals, huge, expensive, ultra-durable machines expected to survive for 15 or 20 years. Starlink moved in the opposite direction. Smaller satellites, cheaper satellites, shorter design cycles, faster manufacturing, constant iteration. And instead of treating each unit like a treasure that must last forever, many were designed to deorbit at the end of their service life and burn up in the atmosphere. To veterans of old-school aerospace, that approach looked almost heretical. But that was exactly the point. Musk was not trying to build a handful of masterpieces. He was trying to build an orbital factory model. That change in philosophy turned into one of Starlink's biggest advantages. To understand why Starlink succeeded where many earlier satellite projects failed, you have to understand the most important design choice in the entire system: altitude. Traditional satellite internet usually depended on a small number of very large satellites parked in geostationary orbit, roughly 36,000 kilometers above Earth. That let a single satellite cover a huge area, but it came with a serious problem: latency. If a signal has to travel that far into space and back again, delay is unavoidable. That is why older satellite internet often felt sluggish. Web pages loaded slowly, video calls lagged, online gaming was miserable. Even simple interactive tasks could feel awkward. Starlink flipped that model. Instead of a few giant satellites very far away, it used thousands, and eventually tens of thousands, of much smaller satellites in low Earth orbit, often around 550 kilometers above the planet. That one decision changed the user experience. With the satellites much closer, latency dropped dramatically, often into the range of roughly 20 to 40 milliseconds. That is not the same as fiber, but it is close enough that satellite internet stopped feeling like a last resort and started feeling like a serious broadband product. In simple terms, Starlink made satellite internet feel normal enough for everyday use. But putting thousands of satellites into low orbit was only the first step. The next challenge was making them behave like a real network instead of a loose swarm. In the early configuration, Starlink satellites worked more like relays. A user's signal would go up to a satellite, then back down to a nearby ground station, and only then into the broader internet. That setup worked, but it still meant the network depended heavily on the location of those ground stations. So SpaceX pushed further. One of the biggest breakthroughs was the introduction of optical inter-satellite links, space lasers essentially. These allow satellites to send data directly to one another without immediately routing it back down to Earth. That mattered for a very simple reason. Once satellites can pass data across orbit, the network stops being just a collection of access points. It starts becoming a true space-based backbone. Picture a ship in the middle of the Atlantic. Instead of needing a nearby ground station, its signal can hop across multiple satellites by laser before finally dropping down to Earth at a distant gateway. In effect, part of the internet itself begins to stretch across orbit. There is another fascinating twist here. Light travels faster through the vacuum of space than it does through fiber optic glass. Over very long distances, a mature orbital laser network could theoretically route some traffic faster than undersea fiber. That possibility is one reason Starlink matters far beyond rural broadband. This is not just about getting Wi-Fi to a cabin in Montana. It is about building a new communications layer above the planet. That is why the network began reaching places the old terrestrial model had always struggled to serve economically. Remote research stations, maritime routes, mining operations, rural communities, and regions where fiber was too expensive, towers too sparse, or geography too hostile. Then, Musk pushed the idea further. In early 2026, Starlink's direct-to-cell service began commercial rollout through carrier partners in the United States and New Zealand. At this stage, the service is mainly focused on text messaging through ordinary LTE phones, no dish, no special satellite handset, and no bulky external hardware. At first glance, that may sound modest, just texting. Strategically, it is a very big signal. Because texting is step one, the roadmap points toward data, IoT connectivity, and eventually voice. If that progression works, then the meaning of a dead zone starts to change. Your phone would no longer depend only on terrestrial cell towers. In some situations, it could also reach upward. And that is the point where Starlink stops looking like a niche rural broadband provider and starts looking like a challenge to the telecom model itself. For traditional telecom giants, that is not a trivial development. Many of them have spent decades and enormous sums building land-based infrastructure. Starlink's long-term vision suggests a world where orbit becomes a second coverage layer for the phone already in your pocket. By then, Starlink is no longer merely connecting the forgotten. It is reshaping the architecture of connectivity itself. And once one company can connect large parts of the globe, it gains something even more important than customers: leverage. That became impossible to ignore in 2022. When Russia invaded Ukraine in February 2022, communications infrastructure quickly became part of the battlefield. Cyber attacks disrupted key systems, including the Viasat network used by parts of Ukraine's military and government infrastructure. Then something extraordinary happened. Ukraine's digital minister, Mikhailo Fedorov, publicly appealed to Elon Musk for Starlink support. Musk responded that Starlink service was now active in Ukraine and that more terminals are on the way. Soon afterward, shipments of Starlink terminals arrived and were deployed across the country. What followed was historic. A private satellite network, originally built to provide civilian internet access, became part of the communications backbone of a modern war. It helped keep government functions online. It supported hospitals. It allowed units in the field to maintain communications when traditional infrastructure had been damaged or destroyed. Over time, Starlink became associated not only with resilience, but with real tactical usefulness. That changed how governments viewed the company. Starlink was no longer just an innovative business, it was strategic infrastructure. But the Ukraine story also exposed a darker, more complicated reality. Reports and later public debate suggested that access decisions around Starlink coverage in contested areas, including around Crimea, could affect operational options in wartime. The exact details and interpretations remain disputed, and Musk has challenged parts of the public narrative. But the larger lesson was hard to miss. One private individual appeared capable of influencing the communications environment of an active military conflict. That realization hit Washington hard. It forced policymakers to confront a difficult question. Should any private company, no matter how innovative, have that much influence over wartime communications infrastructure? That concern helps explain why the Pentagon moved toward deeper, more formal arrangements with SpaceX, including the development of Starshield. Starshield is not simply Starlink with a new label. It is a more defense-oriented architecture designed for government and military use, with additional security and integration features. If Starlink is the civilian layer, Starshield points toward a future in which SpaceX becomes embedded directly in national security infrastructure. And that is where the Starlink story becomes bigger than Elon Musk, bigger than SpaceX, and bigger than the telecom business. Because now the issue is not just internet service. The issue is orbital sovereignty. As governments looked up and saw what Starlink had become, many of them reached the same conclusion. Low Earth orbit is no longer a side theater. It is becoming a critical domain of power. That is why the response has broadened. China has accelerated plans for large satellite networks. Europe has pushed forward with IRIS-2. Amazon is building Project Kuiper. Around the world, governments and corporations increasingly understand that whoever controls major communications infrastructure in low Earth orbit could gain enormous influence over the future flow of information. This is not the old space race. The old race was about flags, prestige, and symbolic dominance. This one is about infrastructure. Who will carry data? Who will provide emergency links? Who will serve remote regions? Who will support militaries, airlines, ships, markets, and mobile devices? Who will own the pipes above the planet? Those questions are no longer abstract. And that brings us to the money. For years, the biggest doubt hanging over Starlink was simple. Can this actually make money? The network was expensive to build, expensive to launch, and expensive to expand. But by late 2023, Musk said Starlink had reached break-even cash flow. In other words, the operating machine had reached the point where it could roughly support itself. That mattered enormously. Once Starlink began to stand on its own financially, the narrative changed. It was no longer just a speculative side project with heroic ambitions. It was becoming a business with real scale. By 2025, Starlink had become a major revenue driver for SpaceX. And according to Payload's 2026 estimate, it could bring in about $18.7 billion, roughly 79% of SpaceX's total revenue. If that estimate is close, then Starlink is not just important to SpaceX, it is central to SpaceX. The revenue streams are broader than many people realize. First, there is recurring monthly income from millions of residential and business users. That is the most obvious layer and probably the most durable one. Second, there are specialized sectors like maritime and aviation. Starlink Maritime has become increasingly attractive for ships that need high-speed connectivity far from shore. Starlink Aviation has drawn attention from airlines that want dramatically better in-flight internet. Third, there are government and defense contracts, including the highly sensitive world of military communications and related services. Those deals do more than add revenue. They tie Starlink directly into state power. Then there is the next amplifier in the system, Starship. SpaceX has said that future V3 Starlink satellites, launched by Starship, could massively increase network capacity, with each Starship launch adding more than 20 times the capacity of current Falcon 9 Starlink launches. If Starship eventually works at scale as a truly reusable heavy-lift vehicle, the economics could shift again. That matters because launch cost is one of the hidden foundations of the entire Starlink empire. The cheaper and more routine launch becomes, the harder it is for rivals to catch up. Starlink's advantage is not just the satellites. It is also the fact that its parent company owns the rocket system deploying them. That vertical integration is one of SpaceX's sharpest weapons. And once investors fully absorb that, one topic keeps resurfacing: a possible Starlink IPO. For years, markets have speculated that Starlink could eventually be spun out or taken public. That speculation intensified as the business looked more mature and more strategically important. If Starlink were ever listed on public markets, it would likely become one of the most closely watched infrastructure and telecom stories on Earth. Because investors would not just be buying access to a broadband provider, they would be buying exposure to a company that owns a fast-growing network in orbit, with consumer, commercial, and strategic government applications, and with a direct connection to one of the most ambitious space programs in history. And if such an IPO ever happens, where does that money ultimately point? Back to Mars. This is the loop that makes Musk's larger story so distinctive. Starlink connects Earth. The cash from that network helps fund SpaceX, and SpaceX is supposed to build the transportation system for another planet. Every monthly Starlink payment, in that sense, becomes part internet bill and part contribution to a very long-range civilizational gamble. But no empire rises without creating new fears, new enemies, and new vulnerabilities. For astronomers, Starlink has already become a serious source of concern. Bright satellite trails crossing the night sky can interfere with astronomical imaging, especially in long exposures. SpaceX has introduced mitigations such as visor designs and lower reflectivity measures, but the issue has not disappeared. That matters because the night sky is not just empty real estate. It is part of humanity's scientific and cultural inheritance. Then there is the more serious long-term fear: orbital congestion and the Kessler syndrome scenario. The idea, first described by NASA scientist Donald Kessler, is chillingly simple. If low Earth orbit becomes crowded enough, one major collision could create a cloud of debris. That debris could trigger more collisions, which would create more debris, which could trigger even more collisions in a cascading chain reaction. In the worst case, orbit becomes dramatically more dangerous for future missions. That risk is no longer theoretical in the way it once was. Starlink is not the only constellation growing. Amazon's Project Kuiper is coming. China has major ambitions. Other systems will follow. The more crowded orbital lanes become, the more important collision avoidance, debris management, and international rules will become. And that leads to another uncomfortable truth. Humanity is building critical infrastructure in a domain where governance is still weak, fragmented, and often reactive. Space law was not designed for a world of mega constellations, corporate orbital networks, and private actors influencing geopolitical outcomes in real time. In other words, the technology is moving faster than the rules, and the competition is real. Jeff Bezos and Amazon are not going to leave this domain entirely to Musk. Project Kuiper aims to deploy a major LEO constellation of its own. Amazon brings money, cloud infrastructure, logistics, and an enormous ecosystem. If Kuiper scales successfully, it could create genuine pressure on Starlink in certain markets and partnerships. That competition may eventually help consumers. It could lower prices, expand coverage, and reduce dangerous overdependence on one provider. But for now, Starlink still holds the most valuable advantage of all: lead time. It got there first. It scaled first. And because SpaceX controls launch, it built momentum that rivals are still trying to match. So where does that leave us? On one level, the Starlink story is extraordinary. It is the story of a company that took an idea many people considered delusional and turned it into one of the most consequential communication systems on Earth. It has brought internet access to places long ignored by conventional infrastructure. It has changed expectations for satellite connectivity. It has blurred the line between aerospace, telecom, defense, and geopolitics. That is a real achievement. But on another level, Starlink is also a warning, because the new gold mine Musk has built in the sky does not just produce revenue, it also produces influence, dependency, and a new concentration of power over one of the most essential systems in modern civilization: information flow. A private company now occupies a position where its decisions can affect disaster response, battlefield communications, rural development, commercial aviation, maritime logistics, and potentially the future of mobile coverage itself. That is not a normal company. That is something closer to a new category of infrastructure power. And infrastructure power always raises the same question: who governs the governors? Who sets the rules when a commercial network in orbit becomes indispensable to states, militaries, and populations? Who decides what happens when strategic needs collide with private ownership? Who is accountable if one network becomes too dominant? And who protects the long-term health of low Earth orbit itself? Those are not questions for Elon Musk alone. They are questions for governments, regulators, militaries, scientists, markets, and the public. Because whether we like it or not, the Starlink era has already begun. The legacy of Elon Musk and Starlink will probably never be simple. Supporters will remember a breakthrough that connected the disconnected and redefined what satellite internet could be. Critics will remember the concentration of private power, the growing clutter in orbit, and the unsettling fact that one man's company came to occupy such a sensitive strategic role. Both views may prove true. Like fire in ancient myth, Starlink is both gift and test. It brings light, it creates capability, but it also demands control, restraint, and rules worthy of its power. And that may be the real meaning of this story. Starlink is not just about internet service. It is about what happens when private technology starts doing jobs that once belonged mainly to governments. It is about who owns the next layer of civilization's infrastructure. And it is about whether humanity can build powerful systems faster than it builds the wisdom to govern them. So, what do you think? Is Starlink the dawn of a new era of global connection? Or is it the opening chapter of a much bigger struggle over power in space? Let me know in the comments. And if you found this video valuable, subscribe to Knowledge Juice and check out the other deep dive documentaries on this channel. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.